Well, hey, you guys, welcome back to the salon. Now, this is one that I've been wanting to do for a really long time because I'm kind of revisiting a lot of stuff from the 1970s that I grew up watching. So, just like kind of like a lot of the horror media that went on to make, indelible impressions on me as a very young horror nerd, I actually first heard about the Kolchak movies and the series that it, eventually spawned when they were mentioned in the Stephen King book, Dance Macabre, which came out in 1981 and which I read a million times and used as sort of like a roadmap, I guess, for, stuff that I wanted so I could get like up to speed, like with horror stuff when I was younger. Now, I actually did see both of the iconic Kolchak TV movies when I was a teenager, and I remembered liking them a lot, but I hadn't actually seen them since then. So I really wanted to revisit them to see if I still enjoyed them as much as I remembered. And I am very pleased to report that both 1972's The Night Stalker and its follow up, 1973's The Night Strangler, are every bit as entertaining and fun and kind of creepy as they were back in the very, very distant days of the early 1970s. I will note that these seem to be kind of difficult to find on streaming. You can't actually buy them on Blu-ray, which I'll get into in a little bit. I actually watched them on YouTube, but that's all I'm going to say about that. So I'm not really sure, like maybe younger audiences might not be aware, but Kolchak was very much a proto X-Files and was kind of like Chris Carter has basically said that 90% of the premise of the X-Files, he got the idea from the Kolchak movies and series. And what you have here is basically like a hard-boiled investigative journalist who ends up having to contend not only with various supernatural creatures and situations, but also with the disbelief of his bosses and like others in authority, like cops and politicians and stuff like that. So Chris Carter, as I mentioned, who's, created the X-Files, he actually cast Darren McGavin, who played Kolchak, in the X-Files as the character Arthur Dales, who is called like the father of the X-Files, as a tribute to the inspiration that the original show and the original series on the movies had provided. Carter's original idea was to have Darren McGavin play the actual Kolchak character, but I guess Darren McGavin didn't want to do that, so they wrote a new character for him instead, which was kind of similar. Now, for some reason, even though I was aware that they were both things, that there were TV movies and that there was a series, I had always been under the mistaken impression that the Kolchak TV series came first and that the films were like later expansions upon the lore, because that happens sometimes. But I was surprised to find out that I actually got it completely backwards. When The Night Stalker aired as the ABC Movie of the Week in January of 1972, it actually wasn't trading on an existing character at all. It was the entirely original creation of a novelist named Jeff Rice. Now, the unpublished book he wrote, which was about a vampire kind of terrorizing the streets of Las Vegas, was originally called The Kolchak Papers. And it wasn't really drawing, I guess he was trying to get it published, but it wasn't really getting any interest in the publishing world until an agent by the name of Rick Ray happened to read it. Now, he thought that the novel was very cinematic and would actually like make a good movie. So after it kind of went through the proper channels and whatnot, it ended up being adapted for television by none other than the legendary horror and science fiction writer Richard Matheson, and produced by the equally celebrated genre veteran Dan Curtis, who at this point had already kind of like earned his bona fides by creating the outstanding gothic soap opera Dark Shadows in the 1960s, and he would go on to do like a really lot of really good TV movies in the 1970s as well. So then they brought on director John Llewellyn Moxey, who was a veteran of much TV and some films as well. He was also brought on board to kind of bring the novelist's vision to life, I guess. Now, the initial broadcast of The Night Stalker was wildly successful. At its time, it was the most highly rated original TV movie in the United States, and it even got a subsequent theatrical release overseas. That's how popular it was, and immediately merited work on a sequel. So the novelist, Jeff Rice, whose Kolchak papers had now been retitled The Night Stalker, was tasked with writing a follow-up, like a sequel, based on a screenplay that was written by Richard Richard Matheson. So both novels were then released in like early 1974 after both of the TV movies had aired. Now, the second movie was also a big success, and that kind of prompted ABC to develop a series out of the concept, utilizing Darren McGavin in the main role. The series was actually revitalized briefly in 2005. There was like a reboot, which actually starred Stuart Townsend, who was in Queen of the Damned, and he played Dorian Gray in The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. He was, in the role of Carl Kolchak, although it only ran for 6 weeks and seems to have been largely forgotten about nowadays. I didn't even know it existed until literally today. I think the main reason that the Kolchak films of the 1970s like appealed so strongly to audiences was the character of Kolchak himself. I mean, as portrayed by Darren McGavin, he's just this rumpled reporter. He's very no nonsense. He's kind of like lovably sleazy, I guess. I don't know if sleazy is the right word, but it's kind of like that, you know what I mean? And he will just like, he's very tenacious. Like he'll stop at nothing to get a story and will follow his leads like wherever they take him, which is an attribute that has a habit of constantly landing his ass in hot water, especially when he insists on reporting on things that people in power don't want him to disclose. So he's like always getting yelled at. He's always in trouble. In The Night Stalker, and also, in The Night Strangler as well, which was the second one, there's kind of like this great, very barbed like banter and like even like screaming matches like between Kolchak and his, endlessly beleaguered editor, whose name is Tony Vincenzo. He's actually played by a very prolific character actor. You've seen this dude in a million things. His name is Simon Oakland. He was actually in Psycho. He was in West Side Story. He was in Bullet. He's been in a million things, like I said. I think that's like a definite highlight. And those arguments and like that conflict seems to have been deliberately like expanded and amped up like in the sequel and the second one for comedic purposes. I do kind of feel like the tone of the first Kolchak film is like a bit darker and a bit grimmer, but does have notes of kind of wry humor, sarcastic humor in it, while the second film and the series that followed kind of heightened the humor considerably. The first one's funny, but it's not like as funny as like the later stuff was. I think, too, that Kolchak, like his character being so down to earth and a little bit like ever so slightly arrogant, but like in a likable kind of way, I think that him having that demeanor, it really contrasts well with the supernatural cases like that he gets drawn into. Because it's a lot easier for the audience to believe in like vampires and other flavors of walking corpses, if this kind of like hard-nosed, wisecracking son of a bitch is forced to believe in them too. So, that suspension of disbelief is like really important. And I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing they got across. And you're also, on Kolchak's side as he's kind of like the little guy, like fighting against the system because he's always, fighting and usually failing to get the real story like out to the public before, like I said, the cops and DA and politicians and all that like cover the whole thing up because they don't want anybody knowing that there's supernatural creatures running around. So in the opening of the first film from 1972, which is called The Night Stalker, we see Kolchak in this sort of like down market motel room. And his voiceover, he's like recording like into a tape recorder. So his voiceover is telling us about the case that he just had the misfortune of working on. And he's like, the truth of this case is likely never to come to light. So this is actually like a great setup, really tailor-made for a series. It's actually later revealed that Kolchak has been fired multiple times from newspapers all over the country due to his habit, like I said, of writing about, I guess, like inconvenient truth stuff people don't want other people to know. And indeed, he does get unceremoniously bounced from the job at the heart of this movie as well, an event which actually kind of like deepens his cynicism like going forward. So the case that The Night Stalker centers around, it starts out as nothing but like just a routine homicide, right? It's just a woman who worked at one of the casinos like on the Las Vegas Strip. She ends up dead. Now, her body has been seemingly drained of blood, but investigators are very keen to keep this little factoid away from the press because they don't want everybody to like panic and freak out. Now, Kolchak actually ends up finding out about it through his connections, like he has a friend like at the morgue or whatever who gives him info, and he decides he's going to delve deeper into the case. Like he gets put on the case, but, the more that he finds out about it, the more people are like, yeah, you can't report that. So more women soon start like falling victim to this purported serial killer. All of them worked nights, usually in casinos or something because it's Vegas, and all of them were found with the blood completely drained from their bodies and no blood, anywhere at the scene. One woman was even found lying on a very like sandy section of beach with no footprints anywhere around her, which actually like kind of prompts the investigators to wonder, let's like, did the murderer throw her there or what's the deal? Like there's no footprints. That's really strange. Now, after 4 women have turned up dead and a 5th goes missing, like we actually see this scene that's like the 5th woman she's getting in her car and then like the killer like comes up to her and she tries to sick her Doberman like on the killer, but sadly the hero dog gets brutally killed by the murderer, and the woman gets abducted anyway. Like you don't actually find out what happens to her until later on. So as all that's going on, like Kolchak is becoming, all but convinced that the murderer is either a real vampire or a crazy dude who believes that he's an actual vampire. Now he points out to, the powers that be, he's like, not only have all of the victims been essentially like completely exsanguinated, right, but all have these telltale wounds on their throats that look like bite marks, and they also have traces of human saliva on them, which is another fact that the cops have been trying to keep under wraps. Now, at one stage, the perpetrator is spotted robbing a hospital's blood bank, and when he's actually confronted by the hospital staff, he's able to just like toss nurses and orderlies around like rag dolls. Now, the cops arrive and fire on him as he flees like through the parking lot, but their bullets don't seem to have any effect on him at all. So after this whole debacle, and after discovering that the suspect, whose name is Janos Skorzeny, I think is how you pronounce his last name, is an international fugitive who's actually wanted all over Europe in connection with a series of similar murders, like going back to the late 19th century, which they're positing it's like, well, that would make him about 80 years old, which, like I said, is not crazy, 80 years old, but witness reports, people that have seen him said actually he just looked like he was in his 40s. There's no way that dude's an 80-year-old man like throwing people around like that. So it's not like they're like, oh my god, he's 200 years old. It's like he's still like of a reasonable age, but not as old as he looks, obviously. So after that, like Kolchak is basically like, okay, this dude has got to be like an actual honest to goodness vampire. Now, his hot and much younger girlfriend, Gail, who also works at a casino and who's actually played by Carol Lindley, who was in the Poseidon Adventure, matter of fact. She actually like encourages Kolchak to read some library books about vampire lore because it was the early 70s and nobody knew shit about vampires, I guess. So you always had to have a scene where people were reading a vampire and going, oh my god, I never heard before that you just like put a stake through their heart, even though they've been doing that like since the 1930s Universal movies. But it's like, I don't know, it's just always funny to me. So basically like Kolchak goes and informs the police and the DA and all of them that it's like, well, all you have to do is just find this guy's hidden lair, wait until dawn comes when he can't move around anymore, and then stake the fucker. It's the only way to be sure. Now, the authorities obviously are incredulous at first, but after another confrontation with the killer leads to basically like a handful of cops like ending up dead or wounded, and the perp getting riddled with 30 or 40 rounds that did exactly nada to like stop him. He just like hopped over a fence and ran away. The cops, they kind of like grudgingly agree to do what Kolchak says. Yeah, okay, we'll do the vampire thing. If you'll help us do it, then we'll give you exclusive rights to publish the real story. And he hopes that it'll bring him like fame and fanfare after all of this like shit show is over. Kolchak, though, is no chump. And he actually doesn't trust the cops to honor their word, probably rightly so. Now, he actually is proceeding on a tip from another source of his. He actually locates the vampire's residence and sneaks inside before the cops are set to arrive, like at dawn. So it's still nighttime when he gets there. Now, while he's kind of creeping around in the bowels of this like creepy old like mansion with all the cobwebs and shit, he actually finds the woman that was abducted earlier. She's still alive, but she's tied to a bed and she's not looking too good. She clearly has been serving as the vampire's unwilling blood donor. So there's that. So before Kolchak can free her, The vampire like appears big as life. Now I have to say, like, the look of the vampire here is like pretty cool. He's actually played by a character actor named Barry Atwater. He was in, I think he was in a Twilight Zone episode. The monsters are due on Maple Street. He's been in a bunch of other things. So I think he was in Outer Limits and shit like that too. But it's like he's very subtle looking. It's very it's kind of understated. You know what I mean? He just has like this kind of like pale skin with like this kind of pockmarked, and then he just has these creepy like bloodshot red eyes. So like it looks pretty cool. So there's this big battle in which Kolchak, with the help of his friend Bernie Jenks, who's like an FBI agent, who was the guy that like told him where the house was, they're able to kind of like corner the bloodsucker in an area where the sunlight is coming in through the house because, you know, the sun has come up subsequently. Now, just as Kolchak has the stake like poised over the vampire's heart, right, with the mallet and everything, the cops show up. And Kolchak looks at them very, very smugly. He does that a lot, as a matter of fact. Like, whenever he's proven to be right, he's always, like, coming in whistling, like, that's right, I fucking... You know. And then he always just gets fucked in the ass, because they're like, oh, guess what? We're not going to print your shit. And he's like, what? Like, he's always surprised. It's, like, really funny. So he just, like, basically looks at the cops, like, yeah, do something about it, motherfucker. Bam, bam, bam. And he just, like, you know... like hammers the stake into the dude's heart, killing him once and for all. So, all's well that ends well, right? Yeah, not so fast. So Kolchak actually writes the story that they told him, like telling all the shit that really, really happened, like with all this supernatural jiggery pokery. And he's just so certain that it's going to net him a fortune that he even proposes to his girlfriend, Gail. And he's like, we're going to go back to New York City and we'll like start over and blah, blah, blah. But when he arrives back at the newspaper office, his editor seems a little bit oddly dispirited. And then he gets told, hey, the cops need to talk to you about something. And you're just like, uh-oh, you know how this is going to go. So when he gets down to headquarters, they basically inform him that they're going to hang a murder one charge on him for killing the vampire, like killing Scorsese, I guess, if I keep wanting to say like Martin Scorsese. He didn't kill Martin Scorsese. Scorsese, I think is his last name. So they're basically like, we're going to hang a murder one charge on you unless you quietly leave town and never tell anyone about any of this shit, like, ever again. We don't want anyone to know about this whole vampire situation. So it turns out that the editor printed a cover story in the paper, like the one that he had been, you know, told to, under Kolchak's byline, you know, because of pressure from above, like from the authorities. And also, all the evidence that pointed to the killer's vampire nature has been destroyed. So they've basically taken his body and the bodies of all his victims, which it's implied would have become vampires also, like, eventually. So they took all the bodies and they just, like, cremated them without, you know, how do you do? And, you know, they destroyed all the records of all the weird shit, like all the, autopsies and everything that pointed out any weird shit. So there's absolutely no evidence remaining that the dude was a vampire. And it turns out, too, that the cops, before they even talked to Kolchak, even strong-armed his girlfriend, Gail, out of town. Like, I don't know what they threatened her with, but they basically came in and said, yeah, we told her to fucking leave or else, you know what I mean? Now, in the novel that this was based on, I think that the authority figures were even more ruthless, and I think they even did have some witnesses bumped off, though I don't know if they did that to Gail in the book. But I'm just gonna say, like, I suppose in the movie, you could even argue that Gail was killed because Kolchak, like, looks for her afterward for a long time and can't ever find her. So it's possible. I mean, you could have that in canon if you wanted to. So at the end of the movie, like, a very disheartened Kolchak is back in that depressing motel room from the beginning, like talking into his tape recorder and saying no one will ever know the whole truth about the case but him, and that if anybody ever tried to, like, verify anything that he wrote about it, they wouldn't be able to find any evidence because it had all been hushed up. And it's funny because he also says, like, at the end is like, this is the last time I'm ever going to talk about this, like, vampire case, even though in the sequel, like, pretty much from the beginning, he's very drunkenly, like, telling everybody who will listen, like, about that vampire shit, like, back in Las Vegas. It's really funny. Yeah, and that really doesn't do much to endear him to people either, I tell you what. Now, as I said, The Night Stalker was a big hit. So very soon afterward, a follow-up called The Night Strangler was produced, and it aired a year after the first one in January of 1973. And it kind of like follows a pretty similar narrative as the previous film, but with a slightly more like original flair to the killer's backstory. Like, vampires, that's cool, but it's kind of like played. This one has a little bit of a different vibe to it. So in The Night Strangler, we have Kolchak, after being run out of Vegas, he actually finds himself in Seattle. And at the start of the story, it's pretty clear that his involvement in this vampire case and the subsequent loss of his girlfriend, who, like I said, he never does find, has taken a toll on him, as he seems to be spending a lot of time in bars, pestering random people about the vampire killer and showing them this whole scrapbook that he has the whole case detailed. But look, it was really a vampire. It's like, dude, I don't even know you. You know what I mean? It's like, not surprisingly, most people are just kind of like backing away slowly. It's like, can I please just enjoy my Harvey Wallbanger in peace without you ranting in my face about vampires? Thanks. You know what I mean? So it's that kind of situation. So in a shocking coincidence, Kolchak runs into his old editor, Vincenzo, on one of his Seattle bar crawls. Now, Vincenzo, it turns out, was also shit-canned after the whole vampire fiasco, and somehow ended up in the same city as Kolchak. The very persistent Kolchak is able to convince a very reluctant Vincenzo to get him a job at the paper that he's working for, which is run by a very, very stern publisher with the fabulous name of Llewellyn Crossbinder, who is actually played by John Carradine and his awesome, awesome voice. So just like in Vegas, Kolchak gets put on a case where women, this time all exotic dancers, keep turning up murdered. Now, the victims have all had a very small amount of blood seemingly withdrawn from the backs of their necks, like with a hypodermic needle or something similar. But even more alarmingly, their throats have all been crushed by a killer with apparently superhuman strength. So like I said, a little bit similar, but not exactly the same. There's also another very weird detail. Some of the women's necks have little flecks of rotted flesh left on there, almost as though the person who strangled them was already dead. Now, because of his past history with the whole vampire thing, Kolchak is pretty open to the possibility that something supernatural might be going on, but naturally Vincenzo and the cops and all them absolutely do not want to hear this, even though Vincenzo was privy to the whole vampire thing too, but So Kolchak interviews some of the victims' co-workers, most of whom are dancers at this kind of like Arabian Nights themed club. And one of them, whose real name is Louise Harper, but who goes by the stage name Scheherazade, she like befriends him and helps him out with the investigation. Now, one of the big helpers that he has, though, in this one, is a kind of a nerdy and unrelentingly curious researcher at the newspaper. His name is Titus. He's played by Wally Cox, who was in a ton of things too. Kolchak discovers that there were almost identical runs of murders in Seattle in 1952, and then there were some back in 1931 as well. And some of the witness reports from back then, like, stated that the killer looked like a walking corpse. Although there were some other, witness reports that said the man was actually, like, pretty handsome. So that's kind of like a little bit of a confusing thing, like, to throw you off there. Now, while going back through the archives, Kolchak and Titus, the researcher, they unearth like a definite pattern that stretches back to 1889. Like every 21 years, 6 women were murdered over an 18-day period in precisely the same way as the modern-day victims, and then the killings inexplicably stopped. So eventually, Kolchak is able to deduce that the killer is a guy originally named Dr. Richard Malcolm, who was actually a surgeon during the Civil War. And the doctor was also into alchemy, and he evidently came up with a sort of life-extending serum. Problem was, the recipe for the serum called for human blood, and the stuff only worked for like 21-year stretches, after which the doctor would have to make up a new batch or he would start to rapidly age again. That explained like why some of the witnesses from the old murders said the guy looked like a corpse and why some said he looked handsome. Like he would start to look better as he got farther along, like each 6 victim session. You know what I mean? He'd start to look less corpsey as it went along. Now at one stage, I had to call out this one single scene in here. Kolchak goes to an expert on the occult, like to ask about, alchemy and like an elixir of life or whatever. And delightfully, the professor is played by Margaret Hamilton, the Wicked Witch of the West herself, like from The Wizard of Oz. She has a great line in there about like if an elixir of life really existed, she'd basically be like an elderly hot babe or something like that. And it's like, I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was like funny as shit. And it like legitimately made me laugh out loud. So Kolchak is actually able to track the doctor to his hiding place, which is down in like the Seattle underground, which is like a really cool setting for a horror story, by the way, because like I said, the city is built on top of, the old city, and you can actually still go down there in places and like see the way it was like laid out a long time ago. And he discovers that like the dude has like a whole lab down there where he's trying to perfect the serum so it will make him permanently immortal instead of having to do all this every 21-year bullshit. But he also has the mummified remains of his family set up in the place because I guess it's lonely being a functional immortal. I mean, also he's batshit crazy, so there's that as well. So Kolchak is ultimately able to defeat the Mad Doctor by throwing this kind of like heavy knickknack at his glass flask of like immortality juice, like before the dude can drink it. So that makes the doc suddenly age into what he would really look like if he was more than a century old, which, not so good. Spoiler alert. So then the doctor, who's upset that, his shit didn't work this time, he throws himself out a window, commits suicide, just as the cops belatedly arrive, having just figured out where the guy's super secret lair was. Now, Kolchak doesn't get threatened with a murder charge this time out, because the dude clearly like threw himself out a window. But the story is duly suppressed by the powers that be again. And once again, Kolchak is fired and kind of run out of town on a rail. Vincenzo is also given the axe. And at the end of the movie, Kolchak and Vincenzo are like bickering like an old married couple. Like in a car on the way to New York City, accompanied by the exotic dancer Louise, who was helping out on the case all this time. And I guess she decided to go along with them, like on their new adventures. So as I mentioned, the second film in the Kolchak franchise was also very successful. So Richard Matheson and genre legend William F. Nolan, they started to collaborate on a third film about, it was going to be about like killer androids or something like that. And it was actually going to be called The Night Killers. Now, ABC at that point stepped in and told them they actually wanted to expand the concept into a series, not just another movie. And Darren McGavin agreed to star in the series as Kolchak after some salary negotiation, and they also promised that he would get an executive producer credit. Now, the series, which was eventually titled Kolchak the Night Stalker, like with a colon in there, ran during the 1974-1975 season, with only Darren McGavin and Simon Oakland as Vincenzo reprising their roles from the movies. Like everybody else was different or like guest stars, you know what I mean? Now, over the course of the series' very short run, Kolchak investigated cases having to do with zombies, mummies, werewolves, witches. I think there was a succubus in there. There was a deal with the devil in there. There was like Native American myths, Hindu myths. It was all kind of different stuff. But for whatever reason, like despite the variety of stuff on offer and the prior success of the two films, the series didn't really seem to catch on with audiences and got canceled after only one season. And in 1976, ABC cobbled together two more films. One was called The Demon and the Mummy, and then the other one was called Crackle of Death, which, okay. And they were basically just repurposed episodes of the series, which were like edited together to feature length. But these, as far as I know, contained little to no new footage. And, after that, Kolchak kind of passed into cult horror posterity, I guess. So, I mean, it's really hard to overstate how influential Kolchak was to kind of like horror television as a whole. And despite its age, and I feel like maybe a little bit of obscurity, the films still have enough of a cult following to have justified a very nice like 4K Blu-ray release, both of them separately, like in 2018 they came out. And then the series got its own thing, like a Blu-ray thing, like in 2021, and it had the new transfer, and it had a package with all the bells and whistles, all kind of like interviews and commentary and stuff like that on there. It was like a really nice thing they put together. I mean, Kolchak was not only the spiritual predecessor, I guess, of the X-Files, but episodes of the series were later cited as touchstones for like the Omen film franchise, like bits of Jurassic Park, and also this was funny. I found this on the Wikipedia page. Also, one of the episodes was the inspiration for the tiger-headed Rakshasa monster in the Dungeons and Dragons game. So there's that. So although I haven't seen the series yet, I mean, that is maybe one thing I might want to explore on this channel, like down the line, because I am kind of curious to see the series as well. I can wholeheartedly recommend the initial two TV films if you like TV horror from that era, like I do, and are a fan of Richard Matheson's other TV work, which I also am. The movies are very fast-paced, very spooky, and they're really a lot of fun. You know, Kolchak just like banters his way through some kind of like scary situations, and then he's always kind of getting kept down by the man at the end. Even after he repeatedly like saves their bacon, and even though he's like right about everything. I mean, it's kind of like a cynical premise to be sure, but you know, it's the 70s. There was a lot of that going on post Watergate, I guess. And the thing about it is that Darren McGavin is just so relatable and just so world weary and sarcastic that you just can't help but have a good time, like as he sort of just like prowls the streets looking for supernatural killers, knowing all along that all his hard work is just gonna be shit on and covered up, and he's never gonna be able to tell anybody anything about anything. But I don't know, it's just like a really, really fun premise, and I really, really recommend if you like 70s stuff and you haven't seen it, then, and you're into the X-Files too, especially like people that are into the X-Files should really check this out, because this is, you know, Chris Carter has said like 90% of the idea came from Kolchak, and it's something that was really influential going forward, like as far as like horror on television goes, and I feel like more people should probably see it. So that will do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed this breakdown of the two Kolchak TV movies from the 1970s. And remember, if you like this content, please like it and share, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, remember to go over to scaresalon.com, which is a site where I have like a bunch of written content about, you know, horror adjacent stuff, book reviews, movie reviews, all kind of stuff like that you can read and enjoy yourself for hours and hours. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.